Welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, I'm going to dive into a topic that I've been working on for about the last 7 months that quite a few people were curious about when I started making hints about it, but not a lot of people know. Today, I'm going to talk about BDSM in the Middle East. And I'm going to really dive into kink and how alternative lifestyles there in different countries are explored and experienced in a truly, really unique cultural landscape that is. I've had people reach out, thankfully, to me from Lebanon, Turkey, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE. I'm not going to be saying names because I respect all of their anonymity and their practices there, but I do want to start off by thanking these people for spending all of this time talking to me, providing me with information and a deeper cultural understanding of how they practice BDSM. I also want to give a big shout out to my new listeners, of course, and my longtime followers for all of your ongoing support. I really do appreciate you helping me grow the show, starting to throw some more stars up there for me on Spotify and on Apple. And if you can just keep doing that, if you listen to Spotify through your app, go to your phone, click on my show. There's 3 little dots, click 5 stars, rate me. It really does help me keep the show free, and it does help me get the show out there so I can reach more listeners. And if I want to mention real quick, if you want to help me support the show and the work that I'm doing here, I have a donation link on my Spotify profile. I'm grateful for any support you offer, no matter how big or small. So I want to set up today's conversation real quick because there are some cultural layers, some religious and social factors here that shape the day-to-day life of relationships in the Middle East. These dynamics create a really distinct and in many ways challenging environment for the BDSM community there. And the contrasts, well, they're stark. While some regions are open and embrace alternative lifestyles and exploration, others take a bit more cautious and conservative approach. And this tends to be a little bit more deeply rooted in the societal and religious expectations. And for those in the kink community, navigating these expectations often involves a balance act between personal desires and the external limitations. BDSM in the Middle East is a hidden, really complex world where if we thought we were private in the States, or we were in Canada, or even in the UK or Australia, in the Middle East, privacy is paramount and discretion is often a necessity for safety. And it's not as simple as just finding a local munch or kink event that you might want to, partake in, especially the ones that we have constantly, maybe in Europe or Central and South America or North America, wherever. Instead, for many, connecting with like-minded people involves really hidden communities, underground spaces, encrypted digital platforms. The community there is far smaller, often much more private, a tighter group, and everybody kind of knows everyone, and they're very conscious of these unique pressures that they do face. Now, this has really painted a distinct look for me in reaching out. So today, I really want to shed a little bit more light on what it means to really explore BDSM in this environment, how people find the ways that they connect, the risks that they navigate, and how this scene, even though it's less visible, is actually very well alive in the Middle East. Now, first, I want to discuss the whole cultural nuances and the social perceptions that they have from the Middle East, and even for the Middle East looking out and to other countries. And there are a few of us. That's what kind of drew my curiosity one day, is I think there was somebody who came by and liked the writing of mine, and I didn't quite recognize the name. And so when I checked out where they were from, it just said, it was a country in the Middle East. And that's kind of how my conversation started. It was just a real genuine curiosity for me. But in the many Middle Eastern societies, the whole cultural expectations around relationships and intimacy that and how they're created is very specific and sometimes extremely restrictive. Frameworks that make it really difficult for people to openly explore, definitely to discuss alternative lifestyles like BDSM. There's often an emphasis on traditional family structures and clear, socially acceptable guidelines for relationships. The whole idea around intimacy are usually private and often quite conventional, with little room for public discussion on any topics that might be seen as, well, unconventional. And especially with BDSM, it's a very unconventional topic. Now, for those interested, there's usually a balancing act that's required between their public image and their private desires. Many people in the region live a sort of dual life. Now, we might be able to identify with that in Western culture, but we don't identify with the levels of privacy and restriction that are much more seen in the Middle East. And I can tell you right now, I've practiced BDSM on 3 continents in over 30 countries. I've really been a privilege of mine over the last 20 plus years. But hearing about these things actually kind of reminds me of what BDSM probably was like when it was kind of emerging in the States in like the 50s and 60s, where it was really, you knocked 3 times on a door, you wore a certain outfit, and then they let you in. And that's kind of what this is what reminds me of this now. Now, inside of this dual life, it's one that kind of aligns with societal expectations on the exterior, and in their private side, they're able to express their personal interests and desires more freely. Now, this whole duality here creates a very delicate balance. Individuals work to maintain their appearance of conformity while privately exploring aspects of kink that might, resonate with them. Living this kind of dual life, though, does come with a challenge, and that's not just on a personal level, but socially and legally. Because you have to remember, predominantly in a lot of the countries I'm going to mention today, Islam is the law, and there is a cultural bleed over into some of these countries that are very devout and they follow Islamic law. Now, the stigma around BDSM in many Middle Eastern countries and societies can be severe, with strong negative perceptions around non-traditional sexual practices. And this stigma can lead to really quite serious consequences, with individuals at risk of public shaming, social exclusion, in some cases, even legal repercussions if their interests are discovered. Now, in the States right now, I know that there's all of these talks going on, or especially in Western societies with recent political events, about what may happen to our kink sphere. Let me tell you, and I'm not going to make the show political today, but if you kind of had an idea of what I'm going to be talking about, and then you could just apply what I'm telling you, so we can fully understand that we're nowhere near as restricted in Western society as much as they are in BDSM and in the Middle East, and what they have to do in private for their activities. The legal landscape alone in the region, especially for people inside of the lifestyle and other types of sexual practices, they're seen as deviant or even criminal in some of these societies. And that only amplifies the need for their caution and their discretion. Now, none of what we do currently, technically around the world, nobody can actually consent to a beating. So technically what we're all doing has criminalistic overtones to it, right? But in these societies, that's even worse. And this combination of the whole social expectations and the legal risks here leads a lot of people in the community there to keep their interests and their relationships extremely private, carefully navigating how and who they might share these aspects with of themselves. It does become a testament to their commitment, though, and the importance of kink in their lives, that despite all of these challenges, all of these obstacles that they face, many still continue to pursue their interests in unique and really challenging environments. So how do they navigate all of this privacy and discretion inside of these hidden communities in the Middle East? Well, when we look at this, privacy and discretion become the overall arching theme, and it becomes the defining moment how everybody inside of the kink sphere there and their alternative lifestyles work. Now, due to deeply ingrained cultural and religious values here, as well as the strict legal environments in a lot of these countries, these communities tend to operate in almost complete secrecy. The need to remain discreet is a consistent theme from the Gulf states to Egypt, even Israel and Turkey, where some of these societal attitudes about sexuality are extremely restrictive and judgmental, right? We don't see this in Western society. In a lot of my discussions with some of these people, they was talking about a lot of jealousy and angst because they will watch people on places like FetLife or Fetish.com or a couple of other places, even places like Twitter, talk about these things and how they, they're seeing people talk about repression, and they don't seem to people to really fully grasp what true repression is, right? So when we're looking at all of these things, first here, when I said the Gulf states, let me be a little bit more specific. So in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even Qatar, I'm sorry, pronounced properly. In these conservative Gulf countries, where the laws surrounding public decency and morality are particularly stringent, BDSM remains really incredibly clandestine. And if you don't know what that means, I'm talking you're meeting somebody for 3 to 9 months just to see if they're going to vet you and let you come to a maybe munch that's at somebody's house, right, at a certain time with a certain knock. And I thought, this was the way this was described to me, it almost sounded like we're talking about spy stuff. But the reality is they actually take it to some of this level. Because BDSM is really considered taboo there, the involvement in all these lifestyles, this really results in people being severely ostracized or even facing severe legal consequences. Now, for example, in Saudi Arabia, public expressions of any non-traditional sexual activity can be penalized. So BDSM enthusiasts there, they're operating through really darker channels or hidden channels. They rely heavily on underground networks and encrypted platforms. I'm going to get to that in a little bit, to really communicate and meet. They're not out. There's not parades. They're not doing stuff like in San Francisco, or they're not doing, fetish events like they hold in New York. None of that is being done there, right? So all of these things have to be taken down a notch or two. These countries, anonymity is completely the key. It's not a question mark if you're going to do it. It is a key. If you want in, these are the rules. If you fail to participate, that's exactly why it takes you so long to get invited into some of these communities. They don't let you in, and you're left alone. And then often they're even meeting through a second or third intermediary before you're talking to anyone, just to protect themselves. They use pseudonyms on online spaces. They avoid traceable links for their real identities. Their online communities in these regions often take the form of really private forums or messaging groups. Sometimes they have overt tones where they're talking about things which are actually, again, coded. Ironically, I worked in that world, so this is exactly what it sounded like to me, where, they're discussing without fear of judgment, but let alone the bigger thing is surveillance. So before they're engaging anything, they go through this extremely long vetting process in the Gulf states. Now, their process takes 9 months. And I've heard this from more than a half dozen people in these countries. That's right now the average. And the reason why is to ensure that the person who's expressing interest in joining a group is trustworthy. All of the virtual BDSM spaces provide this whole lifeline for everybody trying to find a connection. But when you're talking about real world meetups, they become extremely rare. So they're going through these long processes. So if it's me and I've met somebody and I'm like, great, I'd like to join, I actually have to expose myself first to make myself in the vulnerable position. So I'm basically offering my trust out, and then I have to move forward. But when events do happen, they're highly controlled. They're extremely secretive. They're done in private homes, sometimes hotel rooms, but they're secluded or in a rented space, completely removed from public eye. So, for example, in the UAE, there are reports of small, invite-only events, but they're very carefully managed to avoid any exposure to the public, and the participation is restricted to a small, trusted circle. And when I say small, imagine 10 people or less. It keeps it from getting overly complicated or complex, or feelings getting hurt, and somebody, the protection of the groups and the smaller communities there is actually paramount over the person, because the group has much more to risk by being exposed, if that kind of makes sense. Now, in Egypt, this becomes a little bit more of a complex landscape here. The situation is a little bit similar, but it's complex due to the unique intersection of legal restrictions and the religious conservatism. Like the Gulf states, Egypt has laws that govern public decency, and these can be applied to punish people involved in any non traditional sexual practice, including BDSM. However, legally, there's somewhat ambiguous nature here. There are fewer outright laws specifically targeting or against BDSM, but it kind of more is targeted towards public morality laws. And that can still be leveraged to criminalize people who are involved in this community. Now, despite all of this, the cultural atmosphere is different from more rigid Gulf states. Egyptian society, while conservative, has pockets of progressive thought, especially within the younger, more urban populations, right? Now, privacy here still remains a critical concern for everybody involved. Again, a lot of the interactions happen in private or virtual spaces. A lot of online platforms act as, again, vetting grounds. So this right now is like a common theme. People rely, again, on encrypted messaging apps and have private groups. Private groups virtually from a couple of people that I've spoken to in Egypt told me even getting into a private virtual group can take up to 3 months. And again, everybody's using a pseudonym, so it's not easy to trace back to their real life, right? So it's a lot of coordination through word of mouth or mutual connections to find others who share these interests. And when an in-person event does occur, they're typically, again, held in a discreet place, private home, a rented villa, or even a secluded venue away from public society altogether. And they also have to have a heavy concern that if they are meeting up somewhere, they're not drawing any attention from law enforcement there. Now, due to all the social and legal risks, these events are typically invite only, known only, vetted only participants, and they're extremely cautious on who they trust. Now, in a place like Lebanon and Turkey, there's a bit more of a slightly open environment. And I know it sounds surprising because, I want to get away from what's kind of going on. If we can just picture for a moment, there are people that still live in these countries and they still go about their daily lives. They bake bread, they're butchers, and they got to repair cars and telephone poles. So people are going to get involved in activities, and just focus on that for a moment, okay? There, in these places, the legal environments and the whole cultural aspect are a bit more relaxed compared to either the Gulf states or even a place like Egypt. They still carry their own set of challenges for practitioners, but Lebanon has actually been seen as a little bit of a cultural hub in the Middle East, and is relatively more liberal approach to sexuality, surprisingly. Apparently it's starting to turn in certain eyes. I don't know how much, because this person didn't relay that much to me. But there are some very soft expressions of alternative lifestyles. Now, they're still stigmatized, but they're not doing them in public because, again, violation of the morality codes there. But the atmosphere apparently feels a touch more tolerant, which allows for a little bit wider acceptance of still an underground community. Now, the gatherings here and the events do, again, take place a touch more visibly. But discretion is critical. So when I say that, it might be, down the alley, and then you talk to one guy and you got to knock on the door, and you go in through a basement, and then you go to another place and go up some stairs and go to the left. That's kind of how it was explained to me. So while it might be in the city, there is still a lot of hurdles to go through. Places that, even apartments, secluded venues, out of city venues, again, renting private homes, make sure sometimes the bigger the event, the average gathering, I was told, was anywhere from about 10 to 18 people. Now, Turkey has a stark contrast here. It's got a unique mix of the whole secular governance and the Islamic tradition. And this is a whole nother contrast to the whole region itself. Cities like Istanbul have more vibrant and diverse social scene, which includes people exploring BDSM. And in this context, privacy still remains important, but public events and private gatherings are a touch more common than in more of the conservative countries. Now, similar to Lebanon, there's a balance of open-mindedness, but trepidation and caution. Participants in this country tend to value their privacy. They prefer, meetups in small private places. The vetting process usually is about 3 to 6 months, from what I've heard. Lebanon, it's at least 6 months. Egypt, it varies anywhere from what I heard from 3 months to about 6 months. But in Turkey, the risks are a little bit more related to their social reputation than being concerned about the legal punishment. Now, conversely, in a place like Israel, they're much more similar to Turkey in this because it's a little bit more complex and open here. On one hand, it has a relatively liberal approach to sexuality, particularly in its urban cities like Tel Aviv, where there are people of the alternative lifestyle, including BDSM. They're a bit more accepted. Israel's legal system, which does allow for more freedoms in terms of sexual expression, contrasts, obviously, a lot of the Middle Eastern countries. Now, despite these freedoms, though, cultural and social conservatism in some of the segments of the society still plays a really important role in how BDSM is viewed. So I don't think you're going to rock up to, Sunday, or a Shabbat dinner or whatever it is, or you're going to go to, Hanukkah and rock up in a BDSM outfit. I don't think that they're that progressed yet. And again, we wouldn't want to be pushing that on anybody. I don't know if anybody's going to laugh from that joke. I got a laugh from that one when I was speaking to a couple people in Israel. So I thought I'd try it out here. If you laugh, let me know. If it was stupid, that's fine. Then say nothing. But much like Lebanon, Turkey, people in Israel may be able to attend public or semi-public events, particularly around the whole LGBTQ friendly spaces, but they often still do with a little bit of caution. Now, events may take place in a designated kink club or private spaces where the discretion remains essential. Vetting here usually runs anywhere from a couple of weeks to about a month, sometimes about 90 days to certain instances. People still use pseudonyms to protect their identity, but the community is a little bit more visible than, a stark contrast to like Saudi Arabia or the UAE or even Egypt. But people tend to want to remain anonymous in their settings. This just protects their privacy from the public viewing, right? Even though there's more freedom here or in Israel, the BDSM scene is still relatively small, and, individuals might prefer more private or controlled gatherings to avoid unwanted attention. Now, there are some common threads across this region. All these countries, they have a deep reliance on privacy and discretion. I don't think I haven't mentioned any of the countries I've talked about thus far. Sorry, Jordan, I didn't really have a chance to shout out to you, but I will shout that out now. Again, all of these countries are quite big on their privacy. The people that play in this part of the world, they're very private. You might not get somebody's name. It might take you a year to find out somebody's real name. And there's nothing wrong with that. We have to understand that we're protecting their, in some cases, even their lives. So whether it's legal or the whole social pressure, the more ambiguous the legal environment, or the more stringent, doesn't really matter because it creates tension for people. And privacy ends up becoming something that's non-negotiable. And we can totally understand why. I do. And this really explores a lot more of these themes. Now, in many ways, the Middle East is not just about, it's not about it just exploring an alternative sexual desire, but it creates this hidden network of solidarity. They have a common bond. And these communities really build on trust. If we talk about trust building, the things I've heard really kind of bring a smile to my face about how much they come together, how they protect each other, how they talk to each other. And it requires a level of trust and discretion that's, it's not easy to overstate. I mean, it's not something that's simply you can just overlook because we take it for granted in Western society. We don't live, a lot of us don't have to live with encrypted communications. We don't have to have pseudonyms or secret meetups. But for them, it plays a really important role. And that way it protects their kink identity without expressing or exposing themselves to any potential harm, socially being ostracized, any legal consequences or safety risks. You know, privacy isn't just a convenience in the Middle East, it's a survival mechanism for a lot of these members in these communities. And they face this duality for themselves, and they balance their personal desires with the ever present need to protect who they are. So, how do they do that? That became my next thing. I kind of was really curious about some of the technology that they're using. If a lot of you don't know, in a place like Jordan, it's one of the more technologically advanced countries in the Middle East. They've really, there's big tech companies there. So ironically, a lot of the stuff that they're using comes out of there and then, kind of filters out to the other states. But when we're talking about all these social and cultural and legal barriers, they had to start finding a way. Now, X was a big way for a lot of people, obviously Facebook, but that became a little bit easier to look into because you could see what people, what groups people were in. But these platforms are more than just really convenient tools. They are a lifeline for a lot of them who otherwise feel isolated or unable to express themselves due to all of the strict societal and religious, norms that they face that dominate the region. Now, for us in Western countries, physical spaces like clubs or public events are extremely common, right? And we have the autonomy just to hop online and start talking to people. And we tend to feel a lot safer. But in this context, to meet with somebody who's like-minded and share these experiences often comes, again, with a whole lot of trepidation and reservation. Now, some of the encrypted apps and private communities, they shift these conversations because this gives individuals the ability to communicate in private, right? They use things like Telegram, Signal, even sometimes WhatsApp. And this becomes key because then conversations can get deleted by the person who's in charge of the group, and then it protects everybody. But it also allows them ways to build their relationships up and discuss their kinks, their interests, sometimes discuss and organize events. One thing I found that was really interesting, pardon me, was that there was not a lot of consent violations, which was huge. They do occur on occasion, but they're not in the way that we traditionally in the West think of them. And if somebody violates privacy, that's a huge, besides being a huge no-no, but, maybe like uttering a name or something like that. It causes a lot of social rips and people can be removed instantly. So they really do monitor these things, but for the most part, those things don't happen because everybody's more conscientious about their privacy, right? So these things really do make it a lot easier for them to and harder for outsiders to track or expose their types of activities. Now, in places like Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the UAE, when we, again, talking about this stuff is extremely taboo, using these messaging systems becomes a safer way for all of them. Apparently, now they wouldn't be specific, and that's fine. When I was talking to somebody in the kingdom, which is Saudi Arabia, they were telling me it was one app only. That's what you were allowed to use. If you didn't use it and adhere to their rules, there was no further conversation. So that they ran, I think they were telling me they used something like Telegram to talk and open a discussion. If there was any type of problems, they instantly ended the conversation. They would ditch the phone number. Like it was just like one of those, you pay for a phone, buy a phone or whatever. And then, the conversation would end. Now, if they somehow got through the first vetting, the conversation would continue. Then, if they were going to go into a group setting, it was then another place like Signal. They would meet a couple of people. From there, if they got through that vetting process, the final step was then getting introduced into a group, say, on WhatsApp. And for the bigger conversations that were taking place, like on Facebook, they had to learn in a totally encrypted system of how to talk. So it didn't make any appearances, and it protected a lot of rights. So, I mean, it was a lot of steps. So I have a lot of respect for people doing that because that's a lot of anxiety to go through that process to make it right. But all of these networks include even places like FetLife, despite all of its, Western origins, they have reached a global amount of people that lets them know that they have a place to talk and that they're normal. There's not a lot of places there where an alternative websites do exist, right? They're not, the clubs aren't there, all of these things. You're not buying toys. So all of these discussions have to take place. How do we make, toy makers they get very inventive there because, there's no real sex shops around the corner. So they talk about all these things inside of these programs. One was really an interesting conversation with somebody from Turkey, was that they were discussing, it was emails through multiple Gmail accounts. And after like each email, then they would get the email to another account, and all the accounts were then deleted. And then they were only talking to people through, it really kind of sounds like a spy story to me, because they were like, so I'd go to a cafe that had Wi-Fi. I would use one email, it would be deleted, and then the next day I went across town and I used a different email. And it was like, I can't imagine, honestly, going through that or having to go through that type of level of security and privacy, right? But this is, again, for them to protect themselves, to protect their community. And I think that's the biggest emphasis here. They're actually protecting each other because they don't want somebody coming in from the outside who's, fly by night. We see this a little bit more in Western countries, but there it's BDSM for these smaller groups is taken much more seriously, right? It's just so different, and maybe it's some things that we can reflect on a little bit of how, we're not as repressed as we want to be made out to feel. And again, I'm not going to get into politics. I don't, especially in light of this past week or what's going on. But, we're not as restricted as we want to make it out to be, what's going on in North America or even in Europe. And you're not running across town and using multiple emails every day to talk to the same person with a new account at different locations like you're, passing off state secrets. So that just doesn't happen. Not in Western cultures, but here it's a standard practice in a lot of these countries. So for me, that was really, when they were talking about they're using digital scramblers, they were using proxy accounts. So that's bouncing your IP off multiple addresses so they can't be tracked back to their origin. I mean, it was interesting for me to see the level of commitment that they're going through. But then I realized, again, it's about protecting themselves and the community that they're building. Now, in the multiple people I talked to, for example, in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, each group didn't really have no more than about 18 or 20 people. And then that was it. Then anybody else trying to come in, they were put on a kind of a semi-wait list until somebody eventually was no longer participating. But that allowed them to build and formulate their little family and take care of it and make it much more practical, right? And I think, again, it really does change for us how we're viewing. It's a lot easier for us, right? I can hop on FetLife, I can go on Instagram, I can go on a couple of other places, and it's easy. I can just start speaking to somebody literally in a minute. But it's not the same in these other countries. And I think we take that a little bit for granted, not understanding that. And I think that's what's really important here. And that's what we need to understand, right? So I'm sure there's those of you who use Signal or Telegram or maybe WhatsApp to have your conversations. But for the most part, we don't have to. We can just have our phone. We can always block a number. Another interesting part of all of this was the legal and the personal boundaries. And I kind of touched base on that, but the risks associated go really far beyond just being the whole, you're a social pariah. They're really intertwined, and the consequences for crossing them can actually be quite severe, unlike a lot of our countries in the West, where our multiple sexual practices are legal. But in the Middle East, they're culturally, they're disapproved. The legal framework is an entirely different set of challenges. In a lot of these countries, the regions, the laws are governed by public decency, and their sexual behavior are far stricter. The practices, the things that we do may fall into these gray or ambiguous areas, but they outright are a conflict of their laws. So those risks make it even more essential for them to be very cautious, to be take a vetting to take a very long time, and the stakes for getting caught are a lot higher. Now in some of these countries, they can be charged with indecency or immorality, and the penalties can range from fines fines from small amounts of money to large amounts of money, or even imprisonment. In more conservative nations like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the behavior is perceived to deviate from traditional norms. Any deviation at all can be met with very severe repercussions. Although we might view something as private and consensual in Western context, this can be construed as a violation of their morality laws and even the corruption of public morals. And in extreme cases, they can face charges related to public indecency, criminal behavior, even sexual assault in some of those legal systems, the way they're interpreted there in those countries. In a place like Egypt or the UAE, legal consequences, they're not always as extreme. They still there's still a real risk of legal action. But in Egypt, for example, the laws surrounding sexuality and public behavior are highly restrictive. BDSM isn't widely recognized there. There's not a, come buy your leather hood at the shop around the corner. And the very act of engaging in any of these non-consensual, non-conventional practices, you're going to draw the interest and more than likely arrest by the police. And especially if it involves, public sphere. Now, like I mentioned before, a place like Israel is a lot more liberal. Now, there's a lot more personal freedoms and there's a lot less risk. There, they face much more of a social stigma than anything else. But you're still not seeing deviant behavior that we do in westernized society, where people are going out and opening the doors when the dude's delivering a pizza, right? Because you shouldn't be doing that anyway, yet people on places like fetish.com or FetLife, or they're posting that crap on Instagram, still do it, and they're violating somebody's consent, let alone doing other things. But again, I'm not going to get on that high horse. All of these stigmas that surround our community, they're amplified in Dubai, in Tel Aviv, right? In Beirut, Istanbul. They're much more amplified. So in essence, I kind of relish and I admire the amount of love and care for their community and the amount of scrutiny that they have in place for the things that they do. When they talk about trust and consent there, this is not something, these aren't just terms they're throwing around. They fundamentally believe in this. There's not a lot of ambiguity when there's a contract. You write it, you follow it. You deviate, you're out. And you're not just out like, oh, one mistake. You are out. And these communities, although small, do talk. And that was an interesting thing. A couple of people were telling me that crossing some of the countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, there was somebody young trying to get involved, and they became problematic because they were just pushing on trying to move up their vetting process and wasn't really wanting to wait. Well, when I don't know what that person did, like as far as for a living, but apparently traveled between the two countries, well, the community leaders spoke to each other and talked about the risk. And that person basically became blacklisted. All because it was about lack of patience. So, yeah, I mean, when you're talking about a place like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, where any type of sexual exploration outside of your marriage, it's not just frowned upon, but I mean, anything done like that's done behind a locked door in a private place with the windows closed. They might even travel across a border, because being caught has a severe repercussion to somebody. We don't face that in Western society. right? You want to go and have an affair or have a tryst with your boyfriend or girlfriend or whomever down the street. Yeah, that's not that easy. It's not about just being privileged either. We just need to understand, and what I want to get the impact of this show today is I want you to understand how extremely privileged we are for the things we can do without the scrutiny, the level of scrutiny that they face there, or the consequences. Because we don't have to face those. And anybody trying to, I've seen the stupidity in the arguments, and I'm sorry, they are stupid arguments about what's going to happen regarding the post-election and all this stuff. It's nowhere near as besides being a touch delusional, and that's really what that is. Nothing that's remotely going to happen in the West doesn't even touch their top 10 of the things that can happen in the Middle East. Now, I do want to talk here a little bit about the future as I wind this down here. Now, looking ahead here, there's quite a promising shift starting to take place in the Middle East, particularly among the younger generations. Now, while the region is still going to be traditionally conservative, heavily Islamic, especially in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, there is actually a growing openness. This was one thing that I was told by a lot of people, to explore new ideas around personal freedoms, sexual identity, and their mental health. Now, the shift particularly became noticeable in urban areas, Dubai, Tel Aviv, where, Cairo, where access to all these things and the influence of social media has begun to spark a lot of the conversations about these topics, especially around personal expression. These conversations, though, they're still in their infancy stages, but they're starting to gain a little bit of momentum where people are starting to feel a little bit more comfortable discussing them in public. Yeah, I don't think these changes are going to, they're not going to happen overnight. I'm thinking likely they're going to take a lot of time, but I think it's a step at least in the right direction. In some of the countries like Jordan, shout out to Jordan, for people who know that or Egypt, where conservatism holds a really significant sway, broader acceptance may be a little bit slower to take hold, but you know what? The digital platforms are playing a really big role there, and they're connecting people across borders, and these small but vibrant communities are starting to grow. And it's gonna it's gonna be a really safe starting point to start looking for those looking to express their desires and form relationships, especially as more people start getting involved. You'll have smaller, safer groups around, much more, access to much more or wide variety of private scenes or spaces, and the hope that maybe one day some of the cultural attitudes, they're not going to be gone, but maybe gradually evolve. And this will allow some room for some more open discussions. I don't really think I'm going to see a lot of evolution in a place like Afghanistan. I don't. But there's just nothing against that. I think it's just still a war-torn country right now. But you'd be surprised to know there were actually practitioners there. Very small. But it does exist. BDSM is truly global. No one owns it. That desire to spank or be spanked or do other things is universal to a lot of people. No one group gets to claim it. Right? In the end, our community, it's not just alive and well in Western cultures or South America or the Oceanic region. It's alive and well and thriving in the Middle East. And it's adapting. Despite all the challenges they face, it's evolving. Now, while it's going to remain hidden for now, and it operates despite all of its challenges, it's growing. And it's going to continue to evolve, and that's going to be in response to the cultural and social and legal landscape evolving as well. The road ahead for them is not going to be fraught without obstacles. They're going to be there. But as that slow and steady shift in perspectives changes, especially among younger generations, That's starting to tell you change is happening. It doesn't matter if it's slow and it takes another 10 years or 20 years. At least it's starting to happen. But at least the communities are steadily forging their path, and it's really encouraging to think that one day more of these spaces, maybe both physical, definitely virtual, will exist where they can explore their identities freely and without a whole lot of fear. Maybe one day the cultural hub for BDSM in the world that you really need to go to is going to be in Saudi Arabia or in the UAE or in Qatar. We don't know. But I can hope for them that it gets to that point. All right? First, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible resilience of those who I spoke to and the trust that it took to talk to me and to share your stories. And despite living in environments that don't openly welcome these alternative lifestyles that we lead, you still found a way to explore who you are. You've created connections that are trusting and everlasting, and you pursue your personal expression despite everything that says you shouldn't. It's really inspiring how, even in the face of your societal and your cultural and the religious challenges you all face, and legal for that matter, you all continue to build communities, often in your private homes, that allow you to explore your desires and connect with others who understand your experiences and you understand theirs. It becomes a reminder that no matter how external the circumstances are, the desire for our self-expression and connection is really a powerful motivator, and people will always find a way to meet those needs. And the courage it really does to take to do all of this for all of you out there, especially in such restricted environments, speaks complete volumes about the strength of the community there. And for that, I want to thank you. I want to thank the individuals in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, and all those others who reached out and contributed in any small way and gave me an insight into your world. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for that. The people that are going to hopefully listen to this, I'm going to speak for them, and I hope that they learn something. I thank you for sharing your stories and your insights and your processes and the things you do. Your voice made this episode today possible, and I'm grateful for the courage and the openness it took to share that with me. I really hope for some of you this sparks a little bit of new insight or perspective into the world, our bigger world of BDSM, and kind of brings us all together in a little bit of a way to understand how really and truly connected we are. Now, I realize what day it is. I need to say this really quickly. I typically wouldn't, but I want to say Happy Veterans Day to all the vets around the world. I know it's a U.S. holiday, but to any veterans, especially those who I work with that listen to the show, Happy Veterans Day. You fought to defend your countries. You need to be recognized for that. So that's all I want to say on that. I do have a book out. It's been out for a while now, since the beginning of this year. Tangled Desires, the intersection between BDSM and psychology. You can get that wherever you buy your ebooks. You can download books from or buy a hard copy. Again, please like, subscribe, follow the show. Help me grow it up. Help me get the word out there. Help me keep reaching more audiences. Help me have more conversations that we need to have in the lifestyle. I have a couple of other shows that are on deck. I've started speaking to the Spanko community. Those shows are coming. I think those are going to be interviews. I've got 2 gentlemen I'm starting to talk to. I've also taken the requests. I will be having a show on the psychology of anal sex. It does exist, believe it or not. There's a lot of studies out there. And the other one that was a very curious one, but I actually got quite a few requests for, the desire and standards of grooming of our pubic areas. So, yeah, and I've reached out to the community, and I want to thank all of you for supplying me some of your answers. Some of you still need to get back to me. But, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the show today. Leave them on Spotify, leave them on Apple, leave them in FetLife, or X, or even on my Instagram account. We'll talk. If you have any questions, please get a hold of me. I will not be revealing any names of any people I have talked to. The anonymity of those people actually was done through multiple different accounts. So please don't message me and ask me that, oh, you want to thank them. Just put a comment in the comment section below and thank the people that on the other side of the world have a different approach to BDSM than we do. Right? A lot to think about. I know I'm not even doing it fully justice. There was so much more to talk about, but I just, I didn't want to make this show too long today. But again, thank you to everyone from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for letting me into your world. Until next time, everybody, be safe and stay kink.